Good afternoon. Thank you everybody for joining us today. We're so happy you could be here with us. My name is Tamara Bingham. I'm the Director of Business Development at Center for Change. I'm here with Katherine Zavodni, who I'll introduce in just a minute, and we're so happy you could join us for our webinar today. I'm going to go over just a couple of quick announcements before we get going. First, a copy of the PowerPoint presentation is in the handouts section of the toolbar. You're welcome to open that and download it and reference it if you'd like, although Katherine's PowerPoint will be on the screen for you to look at. But if you want to reference it later, you can find it there. You can also find it on our website under professionals and webinars. In that same section of the toolbar is a copy of the post test. It's in that handout section. This is for reference only, and I'll come back to that in just a minute, but know that you can find that there. You're welcome to submit questions in the questions section of the toolbar. We'll try to get to some of those at the end of the presentation. There are a lot of you on this webinar broadcast, and we're thrilled to have you. It also means that it's just too many folks to have on screen and have your mics on. So if you will submit questions in the questions section of the toolbar, type those in. I'll keep an eye on them throughout the presentation. Then at the end, we'll circle back and I'll give Katherine some of your questions to address at that point. When the webinar ends, there'll be an evaluation that will automatically pop up on your screen. If you take just a couple of minutes to fill out that evaluation, that would be really helpful for us. That's a continuing education requirement for Center for Change. It's completely anonymous, so please feel free to be candid in your feedback, and we then tabulate those results and send those to the CE approval entities. And then about an hour after the webinar ends, you'll receive a separate email from GoToWebinar. It will look similar to the confirmation email that you received when you first registered. That will come about an hour or so after the webinar ends. There'll be a link in that email with the, that you would click on to take the online test. You must take the test online in order to receive continuing education credit. Once you pass the test, your continuing education certificate will automatically be downloaded to your computer. So if you don't see it on your screen, check your downloads file, because sometimes it goes directly in there. Okay, I know Katherine has a lot to get to, so I don't want to take up any more of her precious time. Katherine Zavodni is a registered dietitian, nutritionist in private practice in Salt Lake. She's a friend of Center for Change. We've known her for a number of years. Katherine presented at one of our conferences a few years ago and was a huge hit. She's also a lovely human. She has such kind compassion for the clients and families that she works with, and has such a wonderful approach to health at every size and intuitive eating lens through those lenses in gentle nutrition, and she's just a phenomenal person and presenter, and I'm so excited that you get to hear from her today. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to you, Katherine. I'm going to send this your way, so give me 1 second to do that so you can share your screen. Okay, it should be over there shortly. There we go. Yep, you're just not on your first slide, I don't think.
That's right. Sorry. Come
no
back
worries.
here. Oh dear. Here, let me get out of here
and go quick.
Sorry, yeah, you're getting a little teaser.
No worries, that's great. It gets us excited for what's to come. Okay, there we go. All right, I'm going to turn off my camera and my microphone, but I'm here. So if you need me, holler. Folks, just a reminder, please not to unmute yourselves, because if that happens, we'll have to remute everyone, including Katherine, and then unmute Katherine to start over. So please try and not unmute yourselves. And now I'll turn it over to you, Katherine.
Thank you, Tamara. Gosh, I have heard you introduce so many people, and you're just such a lovely, you give such lovely introductions, and it's such a treat to be on the receiving end of that. Thank you so much for those kind words, and likewise, if you can't hear me, or if you're having a problem, just holler and we'll get it figured out. So I'm just gonna jump in here. Thank you so much to everyone who is joining us today. I'm so thrilled to be here partnering with my friends at Center for Change to talk about something that is one of my favorite topics. the internal family and nutritional self-care, and we'll get into kind of what I am referring to when I say that, but it is sort of grounded in this internal family systems perspective, which I have found to be a really lovely just kind of way to integrate all of the issues that we run into when we're working with folks who are really struggling with food and eating, whether that be in the kind of frank eating disorder presentation or just kind of more kind of garden variety disordered eating, or along that whole spectrum, which, as we all know, covers a lot of ground and a lot of people beyond just those folks who end up with a formal diagnosis. So I am coming to this as an eating disorder dietitian. I've been a dietitian for, oh my goodness, 12, 13, 14 years now. 13 years now. And I pretty much started even before I became a dietitian when I was in graduate school, really focusing on eating disorders. And I also kind of got some experience in feeding dynamics for families, so parents struggling with the feeding relationship. And so naturally, I really started to consider, how do these things overlap? How are they related? Of course, when we work with folks who have eating disorders, we often hear a lot about the food environment from their childhood, from the homes that they grew up in, what they learned from their parents. And so we really start to, especially working with both of those kind of populations, I really love kind of considering this question of, like, where do we learn to eat? Where do we learn about food? Where do we learn how to eat? How do we learn to feed ourselves? So growing from a child who has hopefully some good support with feeding, and that having that translate into self-feeding skills. So when we send our young folks out into the world, what have they learned about how to functionally feed themselves? And then, of course, what can go wrong, which is a lot of where our clients come in, the folks with eating disorders. Like, what has broken down in that process from being entirely dependent on a parent to growing and learning about food and how we learn to eat, and how that translates into the skills and habits and behaviors that we have around feeding ourselves. So I do want to mention real quickly just a scope of practice kind of point. Obviously, internal family systems is a therapeutic modality. I am not a therapist, I am a dietitian. And so I do always want to kind of underscore any discussion like this with a kind of a scope of practice disclaimer. I don't do therapy, but as an eating disorder dietitian and as a dietitian who's much more concerned with your relationship with food than I am about your macros or any sort of kind of number crunching and micromanaging the content of any person's diet, it's a lot more kind of nuanced and a lot deeper than just kind of strict nutrition work. And so how I kind of approach this is, as a person who collaborates with therapists on a regular basis, like, I'm familiar with all of these kind of modalities, and I enjoy learning about them and utilizing them in my own work in the service of nutrition therapy. So I will use ACT concepts and principles and DBT and IFS, as we'll talk about today, in the service of nutrition therapy. So when we're talking about food, what you're eating, your relationship with food, your beliefs about food, I will draw on these therapeutic modalities as long as we're talking about those food related things. I'm not going to then delve into, helping you heal your relationship with your mother or any of that. But as long as we're talking about the food, I consider that to be within my scope of practice. So just a little primer on internal family systems, and this is all just stuff that I've been learning myself as I've been kind of dabbling and thinking about the ways that I provide nutrition therapy and counseling, just to kind of enhance my understanding and sort of the clarity of the language that I use to provide care in that way. So, and I feel like internal family systems has been getting a lot of attention in recent years. It seems like people are really excited to be kind of thinking about things in this way, which I think is really helpful. So it's actually a pretty young modality, so developed by Richard Schwartz in the early 90s. And it's based on this idea that our experience as humans can be better understood as a series of roles or parts within each of us that influence our choices, motivations, and behaviors. And those parts can function in healthy ways or unhealthy ways. So we all have those parts that are at work, no matter how kind of healthy or unhealthy or functional or dysfunctional we might be. All those parts are at work. And depending on kind of how all of that is working and how well those parts are working together, they can present and work and function together in ways that are very functional and helpful to us, or not so much. So just a quick primer on what the parts are. So in IFS, there are kind of individual roles that they define. You've got the manager, who is going to keep things really tightly controlled. They banish the exile, which is one of the other parts I'll get to in a minute. The idea is that the exile, which is kind of the feeling part of us, that gets really messy and hard to control. Like we as the manager, we want to kind of keep that quiet, like keep that in the closet. Let's keep that out of sight. And as long as I can functionally control everything, we don't even have to worry about that. That manager voice can get very critical or harsh. It might be referred to as kind of a bully. And then to the exile, we've got the part of us that feels feelings, that might feel really rejected. Maybe if we have endured trauma or wounds or just painful life experiences, if we don't feel those feelings, and so many, if not all, to some degree of the clients and patients that we work with have this going on, right? We've got these big feelings that we just don't think we can tolerate, and so we have to figure out how to either numb those or manage those or exile those and keep those hidden. And then we've got the firefighter, who's kind of the, when emotions break through, you're going to go to extreme measures. So you might engage in high risk behavior. It might be numbing behavior. It's going to be anything that just seems kind of impulsive when that need to manage or soothe those big feelings that come up becomes kind of urgent, becomes we're feeling like this is an emergency. I've got to take care of this right now. And we'll talk about how these things come up in the eating disorder patients that we see. And sorry, this is like way down at the bottom. That's unintentional. So Schwartz himself I took this quote to talk about the self, which in a healthy functioning individual, the self is the part that kind of is in charge of all of these parts. And that is sort of what makes the difference between whether those parts are functioning functionally or dysfunctionally. So talking about the self, from birth, this self has all the necessary qualities of good leadership, including compassion, perspective, curiosity, acceptance, and confidence. And as a result, the self makes the best inner leader and will engender balance and harmony inside if parts are allowed, if parts allow it to lead. So in other words, the parts are not kind of demanding to be in charge, because, you know, one of the things that characterizes a functional, healthy balance of these is that they're all kind of working together in an integrated way, and no one part is allowed to kind of dominate. Oh, that's why I animated that backwards. So the definition of the self being the core consciousness that can lead the parts and guide them to function in ways that support balance and well-being. Furthermore, our parts are organized to protect the self and remove it from danger in the face of trauma at all costs. Those protective parts will report having pushed the self out of the body for protective reasons. And once they do this, the inner system is on its own with the extreme feelings or thoughts that we call burdens. So This really reminds me so much of the movie Inside Out, which probably most of us have seen, and we've got all our little parts in there. And of course, this is a very oversimplified kind of representation of the emotions that we experience. But I remember first seeing Inside Out when it first came out and just feeling so moved that all of these little characters, all of these roles, the emotions that exist within all of us, want what's best for us, and they really do have our best interest at heart. They mean well, and perhaps they have a really functional, important role to play, but when we get into trouble is when any one of these characters or roles or emotions is allowed to kind of drive the boat without the integrated presence and roles of those others. And we find out that even Joy, who seems, to believe about herself that, if she could just be in charge, she'd be fine. And what we learn is that, when we insist on this just kind of being positive and all these negativity things just need to be put in the closet, like that's kind of almost like what we talked about, the exile, like just stay inside the circle, sadness, like just don't set foot outside this chalk circle and then we'll be fine. But then, we find that that's obviously not really a functional way of living either. But I think it's important for this discussion to just remember that principle that they all do, and all the parts of us, even when they, may really actually mess things up for us and create a really dysfunctional atmosphere within ourselves, they do mean well, and they're doing what they do to protect us. So I think that's a really fun little kind of metaphor for that. So this is kind of a visual that I liked, just to kind of show the whole of the parts and how they function together in a healthy functioning individual. So we have these parts, they're all of equal size, but then we've got the self who's kind of integrating all of those things and pulling those roles in and letting them play their roles in functional ways, because the self is leading and is in charge and is that kind of wise, ever-present part of us that knows what we need and knows how to kind of lead us to a healthy place. So looking at the differences between how these parts function, and I'll just run through these real quick. So as we've talked about, the parts can function in healthy or unhealthy ways. And when the self is present and leading, the functional roles can be played. Amy Yandel Grabowski, who wrote the book, An Internal Family Systems Guide to Recovery from Eating Disorders, Healing Part by Part, she has these kind of alternative terms for those roles. And so she calls that manager the mentor, the exile as kid, and the firefighter as advocate. And so mentor, kid, and advocate, those are all, pretty positive terms. And so we can think of those as, when those roles are being played in their functional ways, we can kind of imagine them in these sorts of roles, wearing those sorts of hats. And when the self is present, those roles can all be played in functional ways, and we don't have a problem. But when the self is absent, those parts can over or under function or become extreme. And so looking at how the parts can show up in eating disorders, the manager, of course, is going to tend towards really restrictive eating disorders, compulsive exercise, any effort that we see to really tightly control everything. And as long as we can follow all the rules and do everything perfectly and follow everything by the book, then we're gonna not have a problem and everything is gonna be good. The firefighter, as you might guess, is going to be more of a binge eating presentation because it's that more impulsive, kind of urgent sort of emergency. Feelings have gotten so big that we just need to take extreme action to kind of bring those big feelings back down into that manageable place. And then a lot of times we'll see eating disorders oscillating between the two, like in a restrict binge cycle. So if the manager works really, really hard for a long time to keep things very tightly controlled, then ultimately those breakthrough emotions and the exile emotions are still going to break through, and the firefighter has to take more extreme action to manage that. And you sometimes can even see this within the course of a day. The manager has no problem being in charge in the morning, we're rested and we're going to follow all the rules and we're going to do really well. And then the firefighter comes out at night when we're tired and we've been restricted and deprived all day long. And that's when, you know, we'll eat an entire tub of ice cream in one sitting. So, and, you know, we have clients come to us with that story all the time, and they think that the firefighter is the problem, but really the manager kind of set them up to have that experience. And so helping them understand those different roles and how they come out, and how within any sort of eating disorder presentation, it's not just about one of those roles, it's about all the roles doing what they do to kind of create this presentation of an eating disorder, however that looks. And everybody, their goal for all of it is to keep the exile in exile, keep that whiny kid who's upset about all the things locked in her room so we don't have to hear about it, because that's just chaos, and we can't deal with that. So both the manager and the firefighter are trying to keep the exile quiet. So having kind of covered that primer in what is officially family systems, internal family systems, I want to talk for a minute just about how I work with families and how this really kind of overlaps nicely with this framework of those parts that we describe in internal family systems. So if anybody's familiar with Ellen Satter, she pioneered the division of responsibility, which is a framework for a feeding relationship between a parent and a child. And it's based on this idea that the parent has the parent's jobs and the child has the child's jobs, and they're both important and both need to be done by the appropriate parties. And those jobs are the parent's jobs, which are done first. So what are we eating? What are we serving? Where are we eating and when are we eating? And I say first because those kind of have to be decided ahead of time. A parent comes and kind of makes this plan for the family, does the grocery shopping and makes all the plans, and we're going to have dinner, and this is what we're having, and this is where we're having it. It's happening at 6 o'clock. And then once that's done, the child comes to the table and literally and does their jobs, which is to decide what of this am I going to eat and how much. And so if this framework is based on this idea that if the parent sticks to the parent's jobs and does those jobs to their fullness, and the child is then allowed to come and do the child's jobs, and there's no overlap, there's no kind of crossing that division line, then we will generally have a functional feeding relationship. So when things go wrong, back to that question of how can things go wrong, generally based on this kind of strict interpretation of family feeding dynamics according to the division of responsibility, those feeding struggles can be understood as either the parent trying to do the child's jobs or the child being allowed to do the parent's jobs. And you can understand, you can imagine how that might look. The parent trying to do the child's jobs is, okay, you can have 3 bites of this before you have to have 3 bites of this before you can have any of that. Or you don't get seconds of your pasta, but you can have as much as you want of the broccoli, trying to kind of impose this manipulation and management of the child doing those jobs of what am I going to eat here and how much am I going to eat. And then on the other side of that spectrum, you have a scenario where the child is allowed to do the parent's job. So the child might be grazing all day, or the child might decide to eat a big bowl of ice cream 30 minutes before we serve dinner and they're not hungry. The child is deciding what we're going to eat, when we're going to eat, when what, when, and where. Yeah. So these just being general examples of kind of crossing that boundary, that division of who does which jobs. And so when a family comes to work with me, one of the ways that we can kind of understand kind of theoretically what's going on is, do we have a breach of this division of responsibility? Is the parent trying to do the child's jobs, which is very common? Or is the child kind of being left to their own devices to sort of eat in whatever way, and we have sort of a chaotic situation that we need to mitigate? So I love to talk about, and this is kind of where this starts to overlap with internal family systems, is what I call kind of the division of responsibility for adults. So an adult might not even have a child. There's no sort of feeding relationship between two people, but within the individual adult in a functional eating pattern consistent with intuitive eating, I get the question a lot of how does DOR kind of overlap, or how is that related to intuitive eating? The adult individual must play both sets of roles, must play both the parent's roles and the child's roles. First, doing the jobs of the parent or provider, the loving provider, to anticipate all those needs of eating, and then embodying that inner child energy to just kind of come to the table and be present and in the moment and just do the eating. And when both of those jobs are being functionally fulfilled, then that can also be a representation of a functional intuitive eating pattern for any individual. So going into that a little more in depth, when an adult is playing the role of their own parent or provider, this is a primarily cognitive role. You're considering budget, scheduling limitations, gentle nutrition, all of those kind of factors, because we're all familiar with, eating behavior is very, very complex and is legitimately influenced by lots and lots of different factors. It's not just kind of I decide how I'm going to eat and then I eat that way. Like, we have a lot of things that are contributing to what would look like what a functional relationship with food would look like for us. The parent provider role is anticipating those needs, doing all the planning, shopping, food prep, just considering all those details. It honors preferences. So one of the things that it's cognitively aware of is, what are the things that I like? What are the things that I don't like? And it's a very big picture perspective, because as adults, in terms of kind of cognitive development, children are not capable of that kind of big picture abstract thinking that's kind of multifactorial and is considering all these things. But as the adult, that is part of our job, is to consider that big picture perspective. And then when we are embodying the child role for ourselves, it's very embodied. It's very somatic. It's just where are we somatically in our own bodies, and what is our experience of this moment with this meal that's in front of me? Does it taste good? How do I feel? What do I want? It's just very right now, as you can imagine, sort of an actual relationship between an actual parent and a child. If I, as a parent, put a plate, set the table for my family for dinner, you can imagine that child just coming to the table and just kind of eating and deciding what they want to eat. And, it might not be exactly what a parent would want to see, right? Like, if we as a parent are really having trouble not imposing on the child's jobs, we might really want them to eat exactly this much broccoli and no more than this much pasta. We kind of have an agenda there, but if we kind of back off with that agenda, we've already done our jobs of deciding what, where, and when are finished. Then the child can just come and just eat how they eat. So that is just kind of how, when both of those jobs within an adult are being done, then we have a pretty good relationship with food. We're being appropriately cognitive and considering all of these different factors, but then we're also allowing ourselves to just come in, and having had things prepared by that loving provider within us, we can then come and just do the eating and have that be a pretty embodied experience. So just like in a feeding relationship, a lot of the time these roles are not being performed in a balanced way. And just like in the feeding relationship, usually we can kind of boil that down to, is one of these roles over functioning or being carried out in a more extreme way at the exclusion of the other role? And so we'll talk about that a little bit here. and how that can lead to kind of dysfunctional eating or disordered eating. And just kind of coming back to the overlap with internal family systems, none of this, you won't find any of this in a book. This is just kind of my musing on, you know, these two frameworks and how they really do kind of dovetail nicely in this kind of work. No matter who we're working with, if we're working with somebody who has a frank eating disorder, or if we're just working with somebody who is really kind of struggling in their relationship with food and they're trying to kind of address some of those things. But there's no kind of correct way to kind of combine these theories. So this here is just sort of my musing on how we can sort of blend these theories or these frameworks together. So if you think of the parent and the child roles that we talked about here, that they could be conceptualized as the IFS parts of the parts of the self. We could kind of, you know, make those comparisons. So like if we're talking about the healthy expressions of those parts, the parent might be the manager. And the child, the way I see this, could either be the exile or the firefighter. So depending on, you know, what kind of child you have or what the behavior is that you're seeing, that the exile or the firefighter role could either one could be played by the child. And then coming back to Grabowski's terms for those healthy expressions, the mentor, or, you know, who's kind of the manager when we're talking about, you know, a healthy, balanced kind of those roles being played, is that loving, providing parent. And the kid or the advocate could also be that, you know, the child role being allowed to function kind of adequately, that expression of the kid, because the kid is there, right? Like we're coming back to, like, even the most kind of theoretically mentally healthy person and with the most intuitive relationship with food or you know, whatever it is that we're talking about in terms of mental health, like those parts are still there. They're just being allowed to function in balance with one another and under the leadership of the self. And again, so how you conceptualize that as compared to or as part of that kind of child-parent dichotomy, or those roles being allowed to be played, is just kind of speculative. And how I would encourage you to just kind of think through these concepts and how it most makes sense to you. Because again, there's not really a right way to think about this. This is just kind of how I've observed that these kind of ways of thinking about this are really compatible. So looking at kind of more specific ways, of how eating disorder presentations can be conceptualized within these frameworks. As imbalances, whether between the parts within internal family systems or between the parent or the child, and feeding dynamics. I'm just going to take a quick sip of water here. So in situations where individual adult clients or patients have that parent role over functioning, and the parent is in the driver's seat, the child is, you know, is kind of pushed away. We don't want our wants and desires and preferences and appetite to kind of have a place at the table. We really want to kind of cognitively manage and control everything about our eating behavior. So we're stepping way over that line and infringing on those child's jobs of whether or how much. It's not me as a child coming to the table and deciding if I want to eat something. It's I'm telling myself what I'm supposed to want and what I'm supposed to eat and exactly how much I'm going to have. It's very kind of externally controlled. There's really no intrinsic kind of motivation or decision making happening. So of course you would tend to see this in more like anorexia presentations or restricting patterns, and we've all seen those clients and patients. Compulsive exercise, compensatory exercise is going to be one of those things where we're all just we're approaching this like a math problem, like a math formula. Like I need to figure out exactly what I'm supposed to have and make sure that I abide by that to the T at all costs, and then I will be eating correctly. Perfect eating being the goal. The child is not allowed a voice. And so this kind of mimics that manager-exile relationship. So the manager, when the manager is over functioning, the exile is nowhere to be found. Get out of here with your feelings and your appetites and your hunger and your desires and all of this. Like that messes me up. I need that far, far away. So that's kind of how that presentation looks. And then on the other end of the spectrum, if you've got a parent under functioning and the child is kind of left to fend for themselves, you're going to have a much more chaotic, reactive, in the moment eating. So you've got those appetites and those hungers and the what do I want right now, without any without any anticipation, without any kind of framework or structure that we can kind of depend on. So, you know, me deciding what I want right here in the moment is subject to what's available. Do I have anything in the fridge? Which is just kind of a consequence of the poor planning. The lack of anticipation of those needs and limits of preparation and schedule and all the things, it really limits the ability to feed yourself well. And this can be for any number of reasons. A parent is absent or unable to fulfill that role. I had a client once not too long ago who she was on a business trip. I think she was out of town. And when she came home, I think the power had gone out, or like the fridge died, and all the food in her refrigerator had to be thrown away. And so what she had done to embody that parent role, shopped and made sure she had what she needed to, you know, be able to feed herself throughout the day, kind of went away. Like she didn't have that because of these circumstances that she had to throw away all her food. And so she found herself inadvertently in this role of the child left to fend for themselves. Like, well, what am I going to do? Like, I need to eat. I don't have anything. And of course, that's not through any fault of anyone, but it was kind of interesting to kind of try on that experience because this was a person who tended more towards the parent over functioning. And so it was interesting for her to be in this role of like, nothing's been prepared for me, nothing's been anticipated. I mean, it had, but she wasn't able to fall back on the benefit of that. So that just being kind of one illustration of like when the child is just kind of left to their own devices. And again, that can be when a parent struggles with executive function. If you have a parent with ADHD who just really struggles with planning and meal prep and all of this stuff, like that might be one of those situations. Or if you just have a parent who's totally overwhelmed and is not really as skilled in stepping into that authoritative role of, you know, imposing some sort of schedule for the child or structure. So that can be one of those things when you've just got a kid who's grazing all day, or for, you know, again, for an adult, if the eating is just totally chaotic and you forget to eat and you forgot to go shopping and you don't have anything ready, so you're just swinging through and picking up fast food all the time, not because fast food there's anything wrong with that, but if that's your only option because there's nothing else available, that's an example of, you know, within an adult with the parent role being underperformed. And then again, you've got your oscillation in between those extremes. So if you've got a restrict binge cycle, whether it's over time or, like I said, within even a single day, you've got, you know, the parent trying to be in charge and really control things, and then ultimately the child role just gets fed up and takes matters into their own hands. When you are following that extreme restriction with just kind of more extreme out of control eating, when you've got that big wide swing of the pendulum, is one kind of visual that I'll talk about with clients, that is remedied by allowing both those roles to coexist and cooperate over time. And then you still kind of have a little bit of a pendulum swing between hunger and fullness, or between kind of the parent and the child role, but it's just not this huge wide swinging of the pendulum from one just extreme to another. Some other ways that we can kind of think about and conceptualize examples of those parts that we talked about with internal family systems. The exile, we're feeling all the feelings and intense, really feeling rejected or intense feelings. The manager is really trying to control eating and banish the exile. And then the firefighter is coming in when the extreme restriction just becomes too much, we're binge eating to kind of more urgently soothe that discomfort. And so in this way, we can kind of, again, marry those conceptual, like theoretical frameworks between, the parent role and the child role within a person, with the exile, manager, and firefighter roles that also exist within that same person. And so we can kind of see those things side by side and understand where they really overlap. So in terms of interventions, to whatever degree, thinking of your individual client cases through this lens or these lenses is helpful. You can hear somebody's story and kind of discuss with them these roles and whichever, either one or both of those kind of relationships that exist within all of us, and work together to determine who's in charge. So do we have a situation where the parent is really over functioning and not allowing the child to have a voice and have a role? Or is it a situation of the child is kind of left to their own devices and there's not really a functional, loving provider who is showing up and providing that structure? Do we have a situation where there's an imbalance between those roles? And if so, which role is over functioning? So if the parent is over functioning, if we have one of those situations where somebody is just desperately trying to achieve and maintain perfectly controlled eating, so our restrictive eating disorders, our compulsive exercisers, those folks who are just kind of coming in with this very clear idea of how their eating is supposed to look, and their job is to make it look that way. We can talk about how to bring the child in. We can talk about, when we talk about intuitive eating, having that unconditional permission to eat, and those principles of intuitive eating that appeal to the child experience, to that part of us who wants things and who has preferences and who has an appetite and who has an emotional experience of all of these things, and those things that feel so messy to the manager role or the parent role who tends to overfunction. Talk about the experiences of that child role and how those are legitimate. The child who might feel hungry at a time when we're not supposed to feel hungry, and that sends the manager or the parent role, the overfunctioning parent role, into a tailspin because, like, we're not supposed to feel hungry right now, and this is not according to protocol, and we have to squash this. But working towards this kind of understanding and acceptance that the child experience is legitimate. And we can, coming to this next point here, practicing embodiment and trauma sensitivity and helping the client understand the somatic experience and that is a friend to us, that what our bodies communicate is a friend to us. It is not something that we have to tamp down and squelch and control and manage and conquer, right? Like, because we can think of, I mean, I'm a big fan of kind of following the metaphor all the way. And I was actually an English major in undergrad, and I love kind of the story element of all of this. And I love a good metaphor. And another metaphor that I kind of think of here with the parent and the child role is kind of a self, like an aware, conscious self, and the body, and the relationship between the parent and the child, and the self, the conscious cognitive mind, and the body also have really beautiful overlaps, and really can be talked about in similar terms. And so the parent overfunctioning and trying to squelch the needs of the child sounds very similar and is very related to if I'm trying to control with my brain based on what I've decided is the amount of food that I should eat every day and the types of foods that I should eat every day, my body might have a very different idea about what I need. And guess what? It's actually my body who knows that and not my brain, which is why this kind of relationship is so important, that it become a trusting relationship, that the parent can trust the child to eat in a way that is good for their body, having provided all of the things. And then the child can trust the parent to show up and provide all those things in a loving, structured way. If my brain, in the same sort of way, if I can decide in my mind that my body is going to show up here and not steer me wrong, my body is here to take care of me, and when it communicates something to me, I can trust that communication and I can trust that message, and in turn, my body can trust me to show up and have food available and be responsive to the things that it is communicating. And so that is kind of the conversation that I'm trying to have, particularly in the situation where the parent is overfunctioning. We need to let our bodies show up with their communication. What our bodies are communicating is not meant to just lead us right off a cliff, which is what I think a lot of these folks are terrified of. If I let my body be, I mean, what we'll hear all the time, if I honor my preferences, like I will just eat French fries all day long, all the time, only French fries and milkshakes ever. That's the fear, right? So I have to conquer that. I have to squelch the messages that my body or that child are sending, because they will lead me right off a cliff. And so coming to the point where we can start to practice trust in what that part of us, our body, is communicating. And again, the body and the child in this relationship, in this scenario, are going to have a lot in common there. And helping people to live in that body, in that embodied place. And again, we want to make sure that we have a good understanding of the trauma history of the person that we're talking to, because that embodiment can actually feel very unsafe based on adverse experiences that we've had. But having done all that and having been sensitive to all that, we can help those clients when the parent is over functioning and trying to so tightly control and manage everything, that your body is actually a safe place, and your body's communication of hunger and fullness and preferences and different desires and that might be really different from day to day. And so it really doesn't work for us to have this rigid plan that we try to apply day after day, because that's just taking our body or taking that child just out of the equation. And this is by definition going to be flexible. And so those are going to be some of those things that we're talking about with those clients who tend more toward allowing the parent to overfunction. And then if we determine with our client that the child is being left in charge too much, so with a really chaotic presentation of eating, we'll work on those executive function skills. planning and preparing foods, and maybe working on kind of a loose meal plan to kind of provide some structure in which the child can come in and kind of enjoy eating in a way that's functional, characterized by a combination of anticipating needs and being flexible to the needs and things that the child role kind of comes to the table with. And the one thing I want to say about this, and what I'll hear from a lot of people who are making an effort to kind of heal from a diet mentality, or kind of live in a way that is not sort of dictated by diet culture demands and standards, is, you know, how do I make a meal plan and have it not feel like a diet? Like, how do I make kind of educated, kind of balanced decisions around what I'm going to eat, and have that that feels diety? And if people have a really long history of being engaged in kind of a diet mentality, a lot of times we'll have just kind of such a strong reaction to that, that when we get into that full permission, we get into some of that chaotic eating territory, because anything that feels structured smacks of that diet mentality. And when we have the trauma of a diet history, a lot of the time we will have a reaction to anything that feels like structure, because that reminds us in our bodies of the part of our life that we spent kind of imprisoned by a diet mentality and diet kind of constructs and standards. So with these folks, a lot of times this second category, if the child is too much in charge, is going to be those folks who spent a long time dieting, and then they went way in the other direction, and they need kind of help getting back to that sort of middle ground where there's really a balance of structure and intention, and thoughtfulness that goes into making decisions around how I'm going to kind of construct my eating environment in my home and how I eat. So and we can talk about how that structure and how that's different, and teasing apart like what's structure and when does that kind of diety message and mentality start to come in. And that can be really fun work for folks too. And the other category that I think of for this second category, when the child is too much in charge, is when we do have a deficit in executive function. So if you have if there's spectrum presentation present, like if we have somebody on the spectrum, or if we have someone with ADHD who really just struggles with those executive function skills, and as a result, the eating environment in the home tends to be pretty chaotic, then we can kind of really zero in on like building and strengthening those executive function skills. There are all kinds of apps that people can use and online tools. And again, we do want to kind of screen those things, because a lot of that stuff is really infused with diet culture type messages, but just ways to help people with those skills of planning and preparation, to provide some structure within which we can arrive at the table kind of in that embodied child energy and role, and just enjoy the food that we've provided for ourselves. So I want to just wrap up real quick. That client that I mentioned not too long ago, this quote actually came from her therapist, and actually Melissa Smith is a good friend of many of us here, and this is actually her I shared that client with her, and she had this message for that client, is that the goal here, if we're not going to be over functioning as a parent, or allowing the child to be in the driver's seat entirely, we need to kind of have that balance of both. And her kind of way of communicating that was that you need to be your own good enough parent. The parent doesn't have to be perfect. that's more of an over-functioning parent goal, is to parent perfectly and control everything perfect. Good enough is good enough. As the parent role, good enough is good enough. And the child's primary job is not to comply. The child, or if we want to think of it as the body or the exile, that's an important role to play. And the role of that role, the job of that role is not to just bow down to the demands of the other roles. The child's role, or the body's role, is actually important in and of itself, to communicate those more somatic, more intuitive needs, and then the parent can respond. So this is flexible, it's fluid, and there's balance there. And so in the name of just helping your clients with, you know, some understanding or framework for the struggles that they're having, I think this can be a really nice way to kind of orient your client and you with your client toward how is what's happening right now not serving us, and how can we kind of restore balance between these parts and roles within us to kind of bring about a more functional relationship with food and pattern of eating. So I hope that that has been helpful for you. Maybe you're thinking about certain clients that you have or have had, and how that might be helpful in some of those cases going forward. So thank you so much for being here and listening. I know we just maybe have a couple minutes available for questions. Tamara, do we have anything there?
Yes, we do. We have very smart, savvy attendees with awesome questions. Great. And a lot of them. So we won't be able to get to everything today. Katherine, I can't see your screen because I have questions over. Oh, you do? Okay, never mind. I can too. I was going to say Katherine's contact information is on the last slide. So if we aren't able to get to your question today, you're welcome to reach out to Katherine directly. Before we get into questions, just a quick reminder, I know we have a significant number of folks on who are clinicians and may need to hop off at the top of the hour. And so I want to make sure that we get to these last two things real quick before we do questions. Number one, when I close the webinar, that an evaluation will pop up. If you would take just a minute or so to fill out that evaluation, that would be really helpful for us. That's a continuing education requirement for Center for Change. It's completely anonymous, so feel free to be candid in your feedback. We then tabulate those results and send those results back to the CE approval entities. And then about an hour after we end the webinar, you'll get a separate email from GoToWebinar. It will look similar to the confirmation email you got when you registered. And in that email is a link to take the online test. You must take the test online in order to receive continuing education credit. Once you pass the test online, then the CE certificate will automatically be downloaded to your computer. If you don't see it on your screen, look in your downloads file because it will be hiding there perhaps. All right, here we go. Katherine, you ready?
You bet.
Hark back. So I'm gonna go from earlier in your presentation, so I'll try hard not to pick stuff that you would have a hard time getting back to. But okay. This person said, you mentioned an author and book when you reviewed the healthy versus extreme parts functioning slide, but I missed the name. Will you restate the author and or book, the one that refers to the parts as mentor, kid, and advocate?
Yes, yes. Okay,
that question's from Marlene, and I bet she's not the only one who missed it. So if you can.
Yeah, you bet. Okay, so it's an internal family systems guide to recovery from eating disorders. And I'm trying to think, can I put that in the chat? Am I able to do that?
I have no idea.
Here. Yeah, I think I can. Okay, I'll write it real quick. And
with that title, I think they'll be able to find it. So that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, next question is from Michelle. Michelle says, how does a parent assist their child's nutritional needs when a child is dealing with depression without interfering with the child's role, parentheses, child not wanting to eat due to depression?
So that it sounds like that question is about the actual parent and actual child relationship, so an actual feeding dynamics situation. So, I'll touch on that quickly. I think certainly it is always relevant to address any of those underlying kind of mental health concerns. And it's, of course, very appropriate to consider how those presentations and those challenges are impacting appetite and eating. I think we want to do what we can to encourage intake if that's a concern, maybe by really prioritizing things that tend to be preferred foods for the child, but definitely a complete, an appropriate way to address that, at least as a dietitian, would be to make sure we are working to address and getting the support we need to address those mental health concerns as part of what we're providing for our child. It's going to be difficult to just continue to try and support feeding and eating without also addressing those mental health concerns.
It was a common question, Katherine. One similar was, can IFS be used with bipolar? There was one that said, how to apply these concepts in clients with OCD and ADD, et cetera. So I think you've answered that in addressing it. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'll let you sum it up.
Well, the thing I would say there is that those sound like more therapist questions. And so
Right.
I would probably address those to a therapist who has expertise in IFS. Again, in my scope of practice, like I will use these things in service of the eating relationship and the relationship with food and eating behavior. When it comes to using those things to address those actual, mental health diagnoses, that would be the scope of a therapist.
Got it. Thank you. This is a comment, not a question, from Kristen. And Kristen said, just a comment, I'm a faculty member with the Ellen Satter Institute, and I'm intrigued with the dovetailing of the Satter feeding dynamics model and IFS. Thanks for sharing.
Oh, that's great.
That's really cool. So I wanted to make sure you heard that.
Super, thank you.
Okay. Next one, for clients who have a really hard time going into their body and sensing those cues, where do you start?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so I think, in terms of where do you start, I always, when I'm supervising other clinicians, I always have this question: what are they there to talk about? Why are they seeking out your help? If this is an outpatient situation and they are having a hard time connecting with their kind of somatic sensations and the communication of their bodies, what is it that they're hoping to work on? What are their goals? Do they know that they aren't in touch with those things and they're trying to get in touch with those things? In which case we can look at, do you feel hungry? I ask almost every single client that question. Do you feel hunger? Do you experience hunger? And if so, what does that feel like? And if they don't experience hunger or they don't know what that feels like, then we can start to really get granular, looking at their experience of eating day to day. Well, if you don't feel hungry, how do you decide whether you're going to eat, or how do you decide when to eat? How do you decide how much to eat? So really getting granular with some of those questions, helping them discover things about their experience that would point them towards those most basic kind of somatic sensory input from their body that will start to get them in touch with some of those situations. And if it's a matter of like being afraid to trust those sensations, or if they really do have a hard time actually experiencing and being aware of those sensations, then we can start to ask, some of those questions about their hour-to-hour, day-to-day experience with food to start to connect with that a little bit, because it's going to be different for different people. So we have to get real specific with their experience.
Got it. Thank you. Folks, we're out of time and we have a significant number of questions left, so I apologize for the ones we couldn't get to. Again, Katherine's email is on the final slide, so if you have a burning question that you just have to get answered, feel free to reach out to Katherine directly. My thanks to Katherine for an amazing presentation, and to all of you for participating today and joining us. We hope you can join us again next month. Our next webinar is on Thursday, March 29th. Watch your emails for information about that. In the meantime, everybody stay well. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.